coffee machine sputtered its last drops into the carafe, the sound sharp against the silence of the early morning. Claire stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the frost that clung stubbornly to the edges of the glass. Her reflection, a pale, tired woman with dark circles under her eyes, looked back at her, and she wondered when she'd stopped recognizing herself. The house was still asleep. Upstairs, her 3 children were tangled in their bedsheets, dreaming the uncomplicated dreams of youth. And Jacob, her husband, lay in the same bed they had shared for over a decade, oblivious to the storm that had been brewing within her. Claire's life felt like a symphony that had lost its rhythm. Each day unfolded predictably. Breakfasts prepared with robotic precision, school drop-offs and pickups marked by hurried goodbyes and scattered papers, evenings spent folding laundry while Jacob half-watched television. It was a life filled with tasks, yet void of spark. Jacob was a good man, steady, kind, and reliable. He loved her in his quiet, predictable way, the same way he loved his Saturday crossword puzzles and the old vinyl records he insisted sounded better than anything modern. And yet, that love felt like a warm coat worn too long, comforting but stifling. She hadn't always felt this way. There had been a time when Jacob's love was all she wanted, when the thought of growing old with him had filled her with contentment. But over the years, their conversations had grown sparse, their intimacy reduced to routine. She couldn't pinpoint when exactly the cracks had formed, but they were there, and she could feel them widening. Claire turned away from the window and poured herself a cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug against her hands was grounding, but it did little to quiet the restlessness that simmered beneath her surface. As she sipped, her gaze wandered to the family calendar pinned to the fridge. It was filled with colored markers denoting soccer games, dentist appointments, and school plays, a chaotic patchwork of obligations. Somewhere in the midst of all that, Claire had lost herself. It wasn't that she didn't love her family. She adored her children and felt a deep affection for Jacob. But there was a growing part of her that yearned for something more, something undefined yet urgently felt. A spark, a sense of being seen, a reminder that she was more than just a mother and a wife. The thought lingered as she finished her coffee and began preparing breakfast. Quiet of the morning was soon disrupted by the sound of little feet padding down the stairs. Lily was the first to appear, her messy hair and sleepy eyes making Claire smile despite herself. Max and Emily followed close behind, their voices already filled with the boundless energy of childhood. Jacob joined them a few minutes later, his hair slightly disheveled, his face still marked with sleep. He kissed Claire's cheek and murmured a good morning, his touch brief and habitual. She smiled back, the gesture automatic. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity, packing lunches, tying shoes, reminding Lily to grab her science project. As the kids clambered into the car, Claire felt the familiar pull of routine take hold once more. But even as she drove them to school, her mind wandered to the unshakable feeling that something in her life was missing. Later that afternoon, as Claire folded laundry in the quiet of the house, she found herself thinking about the gallery opening she had agreed to attend with her friend Lisa later in the week. It was a rare outing, something she had almost declined out of habit. But now, the thought of stepping outside her carefully constructed world, even for a few hours, filled her with a faint sense of hope. Maybe, she thought, it was time to find herself again. Maybe there was still a version of Claire who hadn't been lost to the demands of motherhood and marriage. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she had to start somewhere. For now, the gallery seemed like a good place to begin. The night of the gallery opening arrived with a chill in the air that carried the promise of winter. Claire stood in front of the bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric of a simple black dress she hadn't worn in years. Felt strange, almost illicit, to see herself dressed for something other than practicality. She'd even taken the time to curl her hair, letting it fall in soft waves around her face. The woman staring back at her seemed like a distant memory. "Where are you off to tonight?" Jacob's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tie slightly askew from another long day at the office. His expression was one of mild curiosity, tinged with the faintest hint of surprise. "The gallery opening I mentioned last week," Claire said, keeping her tone light. "Lisa's picking me up." Jacob nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment. "You look nice. Thanks." For a moment, it seemed like he might say more, but instead, he gave her a small smile and retreated to the living room, where the familiar hum of the television soon filled the silence. Claire sighed and grabbed her coat. Lisa's car was already waiting in the driveway. The gallery buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the quiet humdrum of Claire's usual evenings. The space was modern and airy, with white walls adorned by bursts of color and shadow. People moved in small clusters, their conversations a soft murmur that blended with the clinking of wine glasses. Claire followed Lisa through the crowd, feeling both out of place and invigorated. It was while admiring a painting, a chaotic swirl of reds and golds, that she first saw him. He was standing a few feet away, studying the same piece with an intensity that made her curious. He looked up and their eyes met. "Looks like an angry sunset, doesn't it?" he said, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Claire blinked, caught off guard. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he chuckled, extending a hand. "Daniel, Claire." She took his hand, noting the warmth of his grip. There was an ease about him, a kind of self-assuredness that seemed to radiate outward. They fell into conversation effortlessly, discussing the painting, then the exhibit as a whole. Lisa had wandered off at some point, leaving Claire and Daniel to navigate the gallery together. He was different from anyone she'd met in years. Where Jacob was steady and reserved, Daniel was vibrant and unpredictable. He spoke with passion, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described his love for art and the stories it could tell. Claire found herself laughing more than she had in months, the sound unfamiliar in her own ears. As the evening wore on, Claire became acutely aware of how much she'd missed this. The thrill of connection, the joy of being truly seen. Daniel wasn't just listening to her. He was engaging, drawing her out in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "So, Claire," he said as they lingered by the gallery's exit, the crowd beginning to thin. "Do you come to these things often?" She hesitated, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not really. This is a rare outing for me." "Well, I'm glad you came tonight," he said, his tone sincere. "It's not often you meet someone who sees the same angry sunset in a painting." The warmth in his words lingered with her as she stepped into Lisa's car. The drive home was quiet, Lisa chatting about the exhibit while Claire offered polite responses, her thoughts elsewhere. By the time she walked through her front door, the house was dark and still. Jacob was asleep on the couch, the television casting a faint blue glow over his face. Claire paused, looking at him for a long moment. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. She draped a blanket over him and turned off the TV before heading upstairs. As she changed into her pajamas and climbed into bed, her mind replayed the evening in vivid detail, Daniel's laughter, his voice, the way he'd made her feel alive. She told herself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment in an otherwise ordinary life. But deep down, Claire knew that something had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. The days that followed the gallery opening unfolded much as they always did, but Claire felt as though she were living in two separate realities. There was the familiar rhythm of her life, school lunches, errands, and the constant chatter of her children. Then there was the quiet undercurrent of something new, a buzzing energy that she couldn't quite shake. She thought of Daniel more often than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just the way he had smiled at her or the sound of his laugh, it was the way he had made her feel. Seen. Vibrant. As if she were more than the sum of her responsibilities. Claire chided herself for the thoughts, but they clung to her like cobwebs she couldn't brush away. One afternoon, as she folded laundry in the living room, Claire's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Lisa or one of the kids' teachers. Instead, it was an unfamiliar number. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the text. "Hi, Claire. It's Daniel. I hope it's okay that I got your number from Lisa. I just wanted to say it was great meeting you the other night." She stared at the message, her mind racing. Lisa must have given him her number without thinking twice about it, assuming it was harmless. And maybe it was. But Claire couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened as she typed out a reply. "Hi, Daniel. It's fine. It was nice meeting you too." The response was safe, neutral, but sending it felt like stepping onto a tightrope. Over the next few days, their messages became more frequent. First, it was about art, recommendations for galleries or books on abstract expressionism. But soon, the conversations deepened. They talked about their favorite films, their dreams, their lives. Claire found herself looking forward to his messages, her phone becoming a lifeline to a part of her she thought had disappeared. One morning, as she stood at the sink rinsing dishes, Jacob came up behind her and kissed her on the cheek. "What are you smiling about?" Startled, Claire quickly composed herself. "Oh, just thinking about something Lily said yesterday. She's getting so clever." Jacob smiled and nodded, already turning his attention to the coffee maker. Claire felt a pang of guilt that lingered long after he left for work. She wasn't lying, not entirely. Lily had said something funny the day before. But the warmth in her chest had nothing to do with her daughter's words. The turning point came on a cold, gray afternoon. Kids were at school, Jacob at work, and the house was unusually quiet. Claire was curled up on the couch, reading, when her phone buzzed. "I'm at the cafe near the library. Any chance you're free to join me for a coffee?" She stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. A dozen reasons to say no ran through her mind, each one more sensible than the last. And yet, her fingers moved on their own. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Cafe was small and cozy, with a soft hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Claire spotted Daniel immediately, seated near the window with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile that made her stomach flip. "Claire," he said, standing to pull out a chair for her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted, sitting down. Her hands felt clammy, and she clasped them tightly in her lap. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing as easily as it had the night of the gallery. Daniel had a way of drawing her out, of making her feel as though she were the only person in the room. When he laughed at one of her jokes, she felt a rush of warmth that was both thrilling and terrifying. As she left the cafe, her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. She told herself it was just coffee, just a conversation. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. A crack had formed in the mirror of her life, and she couldn't unsee it. That night, as she lay in bed beside Jacob, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every moment with Daniel. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground beneath her shifting with each passing second. Claire didn't know what lay ahead, but she couldn't deny the truth any longer. Something inside her had awakened, and it refused to be ignored. Winter tightened its grip on the town, draping the streets in a brittle frost that cracked underfoot. Claire found herself drawn to the quiet moments in the mornings before the children woke, standing by the window with her coffee, watching the bare branches sway in the wind. The cold air outside felt like a mirror of the storm brewing within her, an emotional winter she couldn't escape. Her meetings with Daniel had become a secret rhythm in her life. It was never planned, never formalized, but always inevitable. A message here, a quick coffee there, stolen moments that felt suspended in time. Each interaction brought her closer to him, yet further from the life she'd built. Jacob had begun to notice her distraction. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, his hand resting on hers, he asked, "Is everything okay? You seem distant lately." Claire hesitated, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "I'm fine," she said with a forced smile. "Just tired, I guess." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, his trust in her unshaken. Claire felt a pang of regret so sharp it left her breathless. She hated lying to him, but the truth felt too vast, too dangerous to expose. Tipping point came on an unassuming Wednesday afternoon. Claire had just dropped the kids off at soccer practice when her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "I need to see you. Can you meet me?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She knew she should say no, that this was a line she couldn't keep crossing. But something inside her, a restless, yearning part she no longer controlled, compelled her to reply. Where? He suggested a small park on the outskirts of town, a secluded spot where the bare trees formed a quiet canopy. Claire parked her car at the edge of the lot and walked toward the bench where he was waiting. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her heart raced as she approached, each step pulling her deeper into the unknown. Claire, he said softly as she reached him. He stood, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat down, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, she considered leaving, walking away before the situation spiraled any further. But then he turned to her, his eyes searching hers, and the world seemed to tilt. I don't want to complicate your life, Daniel said, his voice steady but tinged with something raw. But I can't stop thinking about you. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. She had known deep down that this was where their path was leading, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Daniel, she began, her voice trembling, it can't happen. I have a family. He reached for her hand, his touch both tender and electric. I know. And I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know how I feel. The honesty in his voice broke something inside her. She looked away, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. This isn't fair, she said, her voice barely audible. I know, he said again. But sometimes life isn't fair. And sometimes it gives us something we didn't even know we needed. They sat in silence for a long time, the winter wind whispering through the trees around them. Claire didn't know how long she stayed there, her hands still in his, her heart waging a war she couldn't win. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel didn't try to stop her. He simply watched her go, his expression a mix of longing and resignation. That night, as she lay beside Jacob, Claire stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every moment of the day. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. The life she'd known and the life she craved were pulling her in opposite directions, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Claire closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, she lay there in the darkness, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. Somewhere, in the quiet recesses of her mind, she knew that the point of no return was fast approaching, and there would be no turning back once she crossed it. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that seemed to press down on the world, muffling its edges. Claire sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her, staring at the faint steam rising from the surface. The house was quiet. Jacob had taken the kids to their weekend activities, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She had been here before, on the precipice of a decision she didn't want to make. But this time there was no denying it. The moment had come to choose. For weeks, she had lived in a world split down the middle, her heart torn between the safety of the life she had built and the thrilling possibility of something new. Now, the weight of it all was suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the table. She knew who it was before she even looked. Daniel's name on the screen was both a comfort and a torment. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the device, then swiped to open the message. Can we meet? I need to see you. Her chest tightened. She had known this was coming, had felt it building with every stolen glance, every whispered word. And yet, the finality of it filled her with dread. She typed a reply, her fingers trembling. We need to talk. Park where they had met before seemed colder today, the bare trees stark against the gray sky. Daniel was already there when she arrived, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. Claire, he said, his voice soft but urgent. She held up a hand, cutting him off. Please, let me speak first. He nodded, his gaze fixed on her face. Claire took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice breaking. I can't keep living two lives. It's not fair to Jacob, to my kids, or to you. Daniel's face fell, but he didn't interrupt. She pressed on, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. What we have, what we've shared, it's real. I know that. And it's not something I'll ever forget. But I can't destroy everything I've built, everything my children depend on for this. His jaw tightened and he looked away, his breath visible in the cold air. I understand, he said after a long pause. But it doesn't make it any easier. No, Claire agreed, her voice barely a whisper. It doesn't. They stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging between them. Claire wanted to reach out, to touch his hand one last time, but she knew it would only make leaving harder. Instead, she stepped back, her feet crunching on the frosted ground. Goodbye, Daniel, she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Goodbye, Claire. As she walked away, her heart felt like it was shattering into 1,000 pieces. But with each step, she told herself she was doing the right thing. For her family. For herself. When Claire arrived home, the house was filled with the familiar sounds of her children laughing and Jacob calling out instructions as he helped them with a project. She stood in the doorway, watching them, and felt a pang of something bittersweet. This was her life, messy, imperfect, but real. And it was worth fighting for. Jacob looked up and saw her, his face breaking into a smile. Hey, you're back. We missed you. She walked over and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tighter than she had in years. I missed you too, she whispered. As the day wore on, Claire felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew that. There would be moments of doubt, of longing for what could have been. But she also knew that she had made the right choice. Some storms aren't meant to destroy. Some are meant to remind us of what truly matters. And as Claire sat with her family that evening, the sound of their laughter filling the room, she realized that she had weathered the storm and found her way back to the calm.